to tough it out for the entire day. I'm very appreciative of the care that goes into putting on a good conference. I know you're not getting paid for performance, but I will be giving you a very high rating. I am smiling for the camera in case I'm being monitored here. And I really appreciate the care also of participants. I know it's actually really hard work to stay engaged. So the reason I wanted to play that little music video very briefly, which you can take a look at if you want to see it again in the privacy of your own boring study, you need to get up and move around, is that I think it's really interesting that they chose this particular song to choreograph the robot dance to with Boston Robotics. And the song is, "Do You Love Me? Do you love me now that I can dance?" And I think what we learned from the video is it's actually pretty easy to love a robot that's being cute. But the real question is not whether we love them, but whether they are going to love us. So I'm going to kind of lay out a feminist analysis that brings a little bit more gender and sexuality and care into the story and urges more attention to unpaid work, and what I will argue is the necessarily incomplete and imperfect quote-unquote commodification of paid care. So here's what I'm going to cover. Just very briefly, I want to talk about the distinctive characteristics of care work. And then I'm going to kind of venture into some science fiction and fears that AI will turn men into women or make women obsolete. And then the positive spin hopes that AI could actually alter the meaning of masculinity and femininity and foster better partnerships. And then I want to end arguing that we can really learn something by paying attention to unpaid work, which I mean housework, family, friend, and neighbor care. And I'm going to end up saying I think AI might be able to help us improve the care economy, but its contributions will be very limited, and they will also be very, very risky. So here are the distinctive features, and this is like just a very cartoonish summary of a growing literature in economics and sociology about the nature of care work. It's distinctive, especially for economists, because it can't really be analyzed entirely in terms of the pursuit of individual self-interest. Care provision almost always involves some concern for the well-being of others. Not all the time, but it tends to be a very low-quality service unless there is some component of emotional attachment and moral obligation involved. And this is related to the type of quote-unquote product or the output or the value added of care work, which is often something very intangible, the development, the maintenance, the production of human capabilities, and also a sustainable social climate, our ability in turn to care for others, which is often a function of how we have been cared for. So I think we should really center human capabilities as public goods with big multiplier effects. You know, what I mean by a multiplier is one person cares, the person cared for is in turn more likely to care, and so forth and so on. And that's a reason why it's so economically important and also so valuable. The production of capabilities is also very, very teamy. That is, it involves a lot of collaboration. It involves collaboration between different providers, like parents and teachers, doctors and nurses, teachers and administrators, but it also requires often collaboration between the care provider and the care recipient. In order to teach, I have to convince the student to work, to engage, to be motivated. To provide health care, I have to convince the patient to trust me, to follow my directions, to take care of their health, to do things that might be slightly uncomfortable or uncertain in order to protect that health. And these reasons really explain why it's so difficult to quote unquote capture the value added of care work. In fact, it's even hard to measure it because it's so diffuse and because it has such important public characteristics. And I think it implies that pay for performance often backfires. It doesn't backfire in terms of cutting costs. It can definitely increase the intensity of work, but it often backfires in terms of increasing true productivity. And I think there's a lot of evidence, especially today, of trends in the organization of health, paid health, and education and social services in the US today that's very consistent with this deterioration of quality. It's very costly for consumers as well as being unpleasant for workers. So these characteristics of care work explain why intrinsic motivation or concern for others is so important, because it's hard to incentivize it extrinsically. And this also explains why it's economically undervalued, because you produce something of great value, but it's hard to claim it for yourself. And in my view, I think it goes a long way towards explaining many aspects, not all, but many aspects of gender inequality. That's not something I'm going to really get into in my talk, but I think we can engage with it in terms of the question and a discussion after. So good care is requiring in general, some emotional attachment, some person-specific skills, and some sense of moral obligation. And this puts it at odds with the stylized market of economics textbooks, in which the actor is a completely self-interested person with no interdependent preferences and acts in such a way as to make everybody better off. There's really no right or wrong in neoclassical economics. People have preferences. Some people have altruistic preferences. They derive utility from them. You don't need to reward them because they're getting subjective satisfaction from the care that they provide. And that is really not an exaggeration. But a final reason why the logic of markets is at odds with the logic of care is that markets respond to an effective demand, which requires that people have income to buy the goods and services that they need. And care is about meeting needs, often the needs of dependents, of children, people who are sick, or ill, or disabled, or wounded. And the whole idea of consumer sovereignty and effective demand becomes irrelevant in that context. And somehow the discourse of the market has invisibilized the importance of care work and of care needs. So just because I say that the textbook model is not really compatible with care provision doesn't mean that the actual market is completely incompatible. In fact, a lot of people who are paid to provide care have a very strong sense of moral obligation, get very attached to the people that they care for, and their intrinsic motivation is an important guarantee of quality. And in today's healthcare system, really, sometimes it seems to me the only reason that it works at all is that a lot of the people who are providing it are genuinely concerned about protecting your health. So I think we really need to think not just about unpaid care, but also about paid care and why it's undervalued, why workers in health, education, and social services are paid less than their counterparts in business services, why a lot of care services are produced by the government, and why we need to think about the care sector of the economy as a whole, including unpaid and paid work, instead of dividing the world into market and non-market, to think about care, work that requires care, and work that doesn't. So now I'm going to turn to the question of the weekend, which is, can AI help solve the care crisis? So will care bots be able to solve some of our shortages of care? Will they love us? Will they be able to love us? Not just love us, but they have to love us in the right way, right? So first I'm going to talk about the fears, kind of the downside, and then I'm going to talk about the upside, and then I'm going to come back to unpaid work. So there's a long history of apprehension about technological change disrupting gender roles. And a really good expression of this can be found in Frederick Engel's edition of the English Working Class. Don't get me wrong, I really like a lot of what Fred Engels wrote, but he is very explicit in this particular book about the disruptive effects of mechanization and factory work on gender roles, rendering men emasculated by their exclusion from a paid workplace in which women and children have a comparative advantage because it doesn't require physical strength. So in many cases, the family is not wholly dissolved by the employment of the wife, but it is turned upside down. The wife supports the family, and the husband sits at home. So you may think this is kind of an anachronistic view, but I think it's actually pretty deeply embedded in our culture. And I think an interesting example is discussions of drone warfare. Aaron, this is what I was kind of thinking about as an actually really powerful example of tremendous increases in productivity, which we've seen, especially being used in Ukraine, which has become to a very large extent a drone war. And there's a lot of anxiety in the military today about its implications, but one big implication is that it's undermined the heroic notion of the soldier as someone who risks his life and as someone who has both physical prowess and physical bravery. You know, in this cartoon, this Andy Singer cartoon, this future war hero is a guy, you know, it's a kind of pudgy guy in cargo shorts with a game console playing. And I cited this article by Lorraine DeVoyo called Unmanned, because I think it's a really interesting discussion of how the military is trying to change the discourse around drone warfare to try to neutralize the kind of gender implications of it. And then I wanted to mention Leontief's They Replaced Horses Didn't Name, several people have mentioned it. And I think it's a very interesting trope. And one of the things that's interesting about it is there are more horses in the US today than there ever were in the 19th century. And most of them lead a life of leisure. They are pampered pets. So in a way, that's a positive thing. You know, yes, they got displaced, but they're probably better off for it. But there's also a sense in which Leontief is particularly worried about men losing their jobs, men being unmanned. And he's not noting the fact that women have, for a very long time, stepped out of paid employment and led very productive and very satisfying, if somewhat exploited, lives as housewives and mothers. So, yeah, this guy does kind of look like a horse. So I just wanted to give you a few examples also of how AI and hypermasculinity kind of go together, which I think is partly a function of a patriarchal path dependence tradition. And obviously the best example is Arnold Schwarzenegger as the Terminator, and Arnold Schwarzenegger in his personal life. Famous for referring to a lot of men who earned less because they were in girly jobs. The Terminator is kind of the, representation of the aggressive, hyper-masculine. But there's another example that I like even better from BattleBots. Have any of you ever seen BattleBots? It's a TV series for a while. It was basically gladiators, but instead of men fighting, interesting. We're okay with that?
We're okay.
We're okay with it. I didn't do that on purpose. Imagine yourself in the arena. No, it's not men fighting men. It's little machines that have to be within a certain size, and they're remote-controlled machines. So they have a little arena, and the two machines are pitted against each other. So some of the machines have like an axe to destroy the other machine. Some of them have like a snowplow to drive the other machine off. Some of them have a saw to try. Some of them have a lever to try to do it. So it's actually kind of a neat game. It's better that little machines should fight each other, right? And the fact that it's not entirely virtual, that it actually requires some physical engineering, I think also makes it really interesting. But there was a really epic battle that John Seabrook describes in a New Yorker article that involved two machines that we would say put on the masculine side of the ledger. They were named Eviscerator and Death Machine, against another machine called Kitty Puff Puff. Now, I couldn't find a picture of Kitty Puff Puff, but there are a lot of videos online of cats on Roombas, on vacuum cleaners, and I really wanted to insert some household technology into my show, so I thought that this would do it. Anyway, what Kitty Puff Puff did, instead of an axe or a saw, Kitty Puff Puff had a spool that spooled gauze, and what Kitty Puff Puff did is she, I'm going to call her she immobilized Eviscerator and also Death Machine by wrapping them in gauze. So basically, kind of a very gentle but very effective tool against these other machines. Guess what BattleBots did? After this ignominious defeat, they outlawed cocooning, which is what their term they use for using gauze. Okay, so you get it, right? So it's not just about men, there's also a lot of fear about rendering women obsolete. And I hope some of you have seen the classic science fiction series, Stepford Wives. It's basically kind of slightly repetitive reiteration of the point that men might actually prefer really sexy but completely obedient androids to their actual wives. And I just read this really fascinating review in the New York Times of a novel that Rachel Ingalls wrote in 1987 about sex robots. And what's really funny, I think it sounds like a great novel. It turns out this wife discovers that her husband has been down in his secret, workroom building a sex robot for himself. And she's so pissed off that he's done this that she absconds with the sex robot and hides it and tells him that she's not going to return it unless he builds her a sex robot that's the equivalent of the sex robot that he's created for himself. I don't really know how the story ends, but you can see how it's kind of impishly suggesting that that women can be just as instrumental as men in thinking about the kind of opportunistic sexual use of androids. Okay, so enough about fears. Just want to look briefly at some of the gendered incarnations of hope. And my all-time favorite is the 1951 classic Michael Rennie, The Day the Earth Stood Still. Because this guy appears from outer space, very nicely dressed and very charming. He befriends a widow and her son. There's the camera angle. He gets, shot by the paranoid military who think he's a terrible threat. But he has this robot, this giant robot named Gord. There's Gord, the big silver guy. And instead of telling Gord to take vengeance on this violent reception that he's received on Earth, he utters these famous words. Sometimes I say them to myself when I'm about to lose my temper. Klaatu Baradu Nikto. And they were nonsense words, but and nobody agrees on what they actually meant. But the gist of it was, Gord, don't take vengeance on them. You need to get them on the right path. There's hope for Earth that the scientists can be reached, so don't retaliate. And Gort then explains to the humans that if they don't immediately disarm and cut out all the nuclear armament bullshit, he's going to destroy the Earth. So the threat, this Deus ex machina of Gort, comes to basically protect human civilization. That's a very hopeful view of artificial intelligence. I think another interesting example is really embedded in the work of Isaac Asimov. Maybe not a great writer, but in my view, a really great thinker who anticipated a lot of things that are happening today. He described a galactic empire that was falling apart, kind of under the kind of wave of its internal contradictions and inadequacies. And in a lot of his writings, robots play a part. you know, his central character in the Foundation series is a man named Harry Seldon, who's married to a sort of enigmatic woman who's both beautiful and like a total karate martial arts expert who often protects him whenever he's under attack. And everybody suspects that she is secretly an android, but she's such a good android, they can't really be sure. It's very clear at the end of the Foundation trilogy that she is an android, a very superior android. And Asimov's 3 laws of robotics, if you look at them, are very much kind of the laws of secular humanism. They're the laws that any decent human society should impose on its members. Never harm a human being or allow a human being to come to harm. Always obey a human being unless orders conflict with the first law. Protect your own existence until in conflict with laws 1 and 2. It's not a very consistent set of laws, Asimov discovers, and this is really dramatized in the movie I, Robot, because sometimes in order to prevent harm from coming to humans, you have to disobey them. And that's sort of the contradiction of that film. Human beings are so likely to inflict harm on one another that the only way to protect them is to basically take control. So, you know, that's not what I'm not calling for that. I'm just saying that it reflects a very moral vision of the possibility of artificial intelligence. And then you have Commander Data from Star Trek: The Next Generation. What's not to like about him? He is infinitely smart, he is loyal, he is principled, he's humble, he genuinely regrets his inability to feel emotions, and he does his best to figure out how he could possibly change himself so that he could feel emotions, because he feels incomplete because he doesn't have emotions. I really love it. Battlestar Galactica is another science fiction series that starts out very dark, but it's basically about a war between humans and the androids, the robots they have created, who very quickly learn to mimic humans as androids. And the narrative is really interesting because a lot of the most of the Cylons, the androids that play the biggest part in the narrative, are very big, beautiful, strong, sexy women, like those women portrayed here. And also, the story in Battlestar Galactica very gradually evolves away from a shoot-'em-up, space opera into a story about racial conflict, how humans hate the Cylons and will never permit them to join in their civilization on an equal basis, even though they're incredibly outnumbered. But gradually, as the conflict continues, a few humans and Cylons are attracted to each other and begin to relate to each other and to try to reproduce together. So in a way, this sexual interaction becomes kind of a promise of overcoming a quasi-racial form of segregation. So I think there's a really strong moral narrative underlying this vein of science fiction. My favorite example of a series that tackle the care issue more directly is the series Humans, which appeared on Netflix for I think maybe 2 seasons about 6 or 7 years ago. It was modeled on a Swedish show called Real Humans, and you can also find the Swedish show with subtitles. And it's very interesting because it features androids that have been programmed for empathy and that form strong emotional bonds with their humans. And in some ways, this is the catch that I really like. In some ways, they're so much better than humans at providing care in addition to lifting weights that humans really dislike them because they feel really threatened by it. So the light has appeared. So, like in the first episode of Humans, this guy feels his wife is nagging him to do more housework and childcare. So he goes out and buys this domestic servant android and brings it home. He thinks his wife is going to be thrilled at this substitute for his own time, but she's actually kind of pissed at him for doing this without checking with her or discussing it with her. And some of the reasons for her discomfort become apparent as the story continues. For instance, this android is wonderful with the kids and loves to read them stories. And one night, the mother decides that she wants to read the story instead of the android, and goes up and starts reading with her daughter. But she's tired. She's had a long day at the office, and she's kind of nodding out. And her daughter says, "You know, I like the android better. She's never tired." And this is kind of I think a very interesting twist. It's not that the android isn't caring, it's that the android is too good at it. And then there's this Russian series called Better Than Us. And I've never seen a Russian TV series that I really liked before until this, but I think it's a very interesting series. It's sort of on the same theme, sort of a domestic servant android. But in this case, the servant has been programmed to bond with a man and his children and put their interests above everything else. It's a very kind of, there's no 3 laws of robotics. It's just like, this is my family, this is my man, this is my child. I do anything in my power to protect them no matter what. So it's kind of this kind of, in a way, a romanticization of the traditional kind of maternal ferocity of commitment. And the title of the series, this wasn't the title in Russian, the translated title I think is very telling, referring to this line of androids is better than us. So anyway, these are just stories that I think kind of provoke thinking about empathy and AI. So where does it leave us in terms of what we're really thinking about in terms of using artificial intelligence to mitigate some of our problems with the care economy? So I want to persuade you that we can actually learn some really interesting things by looking at unpaid work. There have been a few mentions of it over the last 2 days, but not many. In general, when people in this group say work, what they mean is paid work. And unpaid work is kind of, in a different category. And this is a very common kind of usage in our culture at large. For instance, you hear a lot about research on work-family conflict. It's everywhere. But that binary, work-family conflict, clearly implies that families are not work. And there's a sense in which families cannot be seen as a site of work because there's something about work and the organization of work that we're critical of and unpleasant of, and we want to avoid thinking of the unpaid work kind of in those terms. And in fact, a lot of what Maria was saying about Campbell and the opposition to quantification, while I agree, I think there is a lot of truth to it that quantification can lead to control. But that argument was used for years against the notion that we should measure time use and measure time spent in housework. And it took decades before social scientists could actually get the resources to conduct time use surveys and look at how much time people spend in unpaid work. I mean, I went to a summer school for understanding national income accounting, just a 3-day workshop. And the instructor said, very, with great sincerity and conviction, he told me that Einstein himself said that not everything that can be measured should be measured, and not everything that is measured is worthwhile. And of course it's true. Not everything that can be measured should be measured, but I really think unpaid work should be effing measured. And I've been having this argument for 25 years in my profession, and it's gradually given way. And there is now a lot of really good data on unpaid work. Since 2003, the American Time Use Survey has annually conducted a nationally representative survey, asks people, what time did you wake up yesterday? What did you do? How long did you do that? What did you do after that? Then what did you do? How long did you do that? What did you do after that? With very few other questions. The only question other than that diary of the day before is a really interesting question. While you were doing that, was a child under the age of 13 in your care? A really good question that I think goes beyond activity and captures responsibility. Young children cannot be left alone without supervision for fear that active care might be needed and to prevent them from doing harm to themselves or others. And now we've looked back to some earlier time use surveys. Wait, let me tell you, let me stick to my first point here for a minute. Consistently, from 2003 to the present, the amount of time that people over the age of 15 devote to unpaid work, housework, child care, elder care, shopping, yard work, is about equal to the time they spend in paid work. This, to me, is a very surprising number. In the country that we think of as the most capitalist country in the world, half of the time that people are working, they're engaged in unpaid work. Now, the catch is that unpaid work is defined as something that you could, in principle, pay someone else to do. That's not a great definition of work, in my opinion. However, it is a great definition if you're trying to think about substitutability between the market and non-market work, because what you're saying is we're not going to count it as work unless it could, in principle, be done by somebody else. So even if you don't like the ontology or epistemology of the question, it's still an interesting question for that, I think, for that reason. So, another really interesting fact is that if we look back at time use surveys, a pretty good one was conducted in 1965, another one in 75. There were a few before then in the 20s and 30s, not so representative. But what's really interesting is that the total amount of time on the household level devoted to unpaid work has not really gone down. The composition of it has changed, much less housework and much more childcare. Women are doing less, somewhat less, men are doing more. There are a lot of things that are contributing to this. Households lost some economies of scale because more people started living alone. You know, I don't want to make too much of this continuity. I think there are a lot of things that kind of go into it, including technological changes in the productivity of housework and social policies and so forth and so on. But what this relative constancy and yet change in the type of work being done tells us is something about the effects of technological change on the household level. And by the way, it's very clear that a lot of household activities can be done in much smaller amount of time than in the past. The microwave oven is a really good example, I think, but and I don't want to go into detail here, but it just is easy. It's just you are more productive cooking at home than you were in the past. Pretty much any way you cut it. And so people took that time, and instead of doing less unpaid work overall, even though their hours of paid work were going up, they reallocated their time to other activities that really can't be described as leisure. And I think what this suggests is that there are pretty serious limits to substitutability between market work and non-market work, and that there are some complementarities between paid and unpaid work that are also limited that we need to think about, and that might give us some ideas about what will happen with technological change and increased productivity outside the household. So, I think a good example of limited substitutability is childcare. Childcare, paid childcare is a very good substitute for supervisory care. You know, back in the day, mothers, stay-at-home mothers who didn't work, spent a lot of time doing housework and other stuff, not childcare, but they were supervising their children at the same time. And supervisory childcare, we know from the AEC-IEET, takes a lot more time than active childcare. It's more like 6 hours a day, and active childcare is more like 2 hours a day in households with young children. Okay? So one of the things that happened was that childcare services provided a substitute for supervision and actually didn't reduce active childcare very much because parents wanted to engage with their children, so they spent less time. They didn't have to prepare lunch for their child because their child was at daycare, but they came home from work and spent time often in a lot of developmental activities like reading aloud, talking, playing, bathing, so forth and so on. And even today, when we talk about expanding childcare, which is a real priority, I think, for our society to expand and make childcare services more affordable, there are very few parents who would want to utilize childcare services more than 35 or 40 hours a week. I mean, why would you want to have children if you didn't, to some extent, have some time with them? And actually caring for children generates, it's not just a productive activity, it also generates a lot of that subjective satisfaction and develops a lot of the social skills and caring skills that we value. So I think, you know, that's an example of why I think in many cases substitutability between paid work and unpaid work has been overstated. I think it's one of the reasons that people want to work fewer hours for pay is that they actually want to have more time at home with their kids or with their friends or with their neighbors or with, you know, other people with whom they want to engage in some reciprocal care. So let me just talk just briefly about what I think are some interesting complementarities between AI and unpaid work, but complementarities that I think are kind of risky. So in the care world, it's really clear that robots that are designed to help lift large people who are disabled or frail as a result of old age is a very positive innovation. The difficulty, the dangers of lifting inert people up in and out of bed have been very well documented. A lot of back injuries and physical injuries due to that. So that is clearly, that's an example of a technology that's improving the productivity of elder care, especially in nursing homes. It's been a big deal in Japan and gotten a lot of publicity. And also robots or androids that monitor vital signs and can set off alarms if like a heart rate becomes arrhythmic or some other indication of ill health. Can be, you know, this is a very useful technology. But it risks the substitution of technology for human contact. And Sherry Turkle's really classic book called Alone Together describes doing ethnographic research in a nursing home where she wanted to interview a lot of the elderly people in this nursing home, and she found that not only did she not have any problem getting them to talk to her, but they were standing in line to talk to her because nobody else was talking to them. They were not getting very much social attention. Those nursing homes were very understaffed and very inadequate levels of care, partly as a result of relying on robotic technologies. Or another example is you think about cell phones and video games. Wow, if you're a parent of a young child, you've probably noticed it's a great technology for entertaining kids. They can do it in the car, you can take them out to dinner with friends, and put them in a room and just stick a DVD in, right? So it's very positive in that, but it's also very risky, diminished parental engagement, and also diminished parental authority. It's really hard for parents, in case you haven't noticed, to take cell phones away from kids, even young kids. Often act out very badly at this route of being denied access to the technology that parents don't always feel is in their best interest. And a final example that I think is kind of, got both goods and bads is the example of physician assistants. The number of physician assistants in the US has increased very dramatically over the last 10 years. And a lot of the reason, or I'm told that a big part of the rationale for this is that physician assistants can now provide more reliable care because they have access to computerized diagnostic tools and to guidelines for providing care that they did not have in the past. So they are better equipped to provide a level of primary care at a lower cost than they have been before, which is a good thing. But as I'm sure you're aware, it's a good thing for routine health care. It's not so good for unusual or difficult or life-threatening problems where a greater level of expertise might be required. So we, as healthcare consumers, are making a trade-off there that includes some risks. And these are the kinds of risks that we need to think about in thinking about the future of the care economy. Wow, thank you so much for your attention. You were great.
Okay, so the powers that be clearly are sending us signs by turning the lights on constantly. So we'll do about 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A, if that's okay. All right.
Thank you very much, Nancy. Really fascinating presentation. I just wanted to add to your sci-fi repertoire. There's this episode that brings to The Outer Limits called Family Values, season 7, episode 1, that I think you might like. Not all of it, to be sure. So season 7, episode 1 of The Outer Limits called Family Values.
Oh, great.
Here's the quick summaries. An overworked man acquires a robot to take care of his household and family. In his absence, he realizes too late the machine may be doing its job just a little bit too perfectly. So in a way, it brings together the two parts of the presentation. That's really all I wanted to say. I learned a lot.
Thanks so much. Really just tremendously interesting talk. I have so many questions, but I'll limit myself to 2. First, I'd love to get your thoughts on what seems to me to be a clear feminization of cultural representations of AI and robots relative to that sort of Cold War era that you were talking about. I think the example that I use in the class I mentioned earlier is the franchise Westworld, where in the 1970s there's this movie with Yul Brynner as a really sort of macho killer robot Terminator type, and in the remake the focus of the series is instead about feminized robots doing sex work. So this seems like a really striking transition.
Wow.
So I'd love to get your
I mean, I love science fiction, but I am an economist. I can't really watch too much of it, or I might abandon my profession. So I really love getting tips about things to watch. Thanks.
The other question I had was about related to the sort of productivity aspect. I was thinking about Ruth Short's Cohen's book, More Work for Mother, this social history of household technology, documenting a lot of sort of utopian hopes that improving household productivity could liberate women from housework. And one of the arguments that she makes in that book is that there was a commensurate kind of pathological rise of standards that accompany efficiency. So all of a sudden, what a clean house looks like actually gets, the standard gets much higher, and beyond what's reasonable becomes a means of enforcing kind of consequences. So I was wondering if this kind of effect of technology leading to this sort of perpetual standard raising.
I think Ruth Cohen has a point, but I think economists in general believe she has really overstated it. And she's overstated it for 2 reasons. One is increases in household hygiene and quote-unquote standards actually have been shown to have really improved health outcomes in the early 20th century, which is a time in which people were learning more about how to prevent disease and what infection and so on and so on. But also, there's kind of a weakness in her economic reasoning, which is she thinks, well, if something is more productive, you should spend less time doing it because you can get it done in a smaller amount of time. Sometimes that's true, but if you really like the service that you're getting, the fact that you're more productive lowers its price. So you might actually do more of it. So a good example of that in today's time use surveys is that women living with men spend significantly more time cooking than they do if they live by themselves. Now, part of that is about gender roles and about doing gender and gender norms, but it's also about economies of scale. When two people live together, they're more likely to cook together, and it's like the difference between dating, where you're eating out, you're generally eating out, you form a partnership, you spend more time, it's another form of that bad word, cocooning, right? And so, if you live with other people, it's actually, you might actually have higher standards for cooking and cooking. And I don't think that vitiates Cowan's point that there was also a lot of normative pressure on women to maintain higher standards. I think that's part of it. So I don't want to go veer in the opposite direction. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. It's great to see you. This is kind of implicit in some of the things you were saying, but I just wanted to bring it out more explicitly that in the Swedish example you gave about the robot who cares too well, it's striking that it's not that the robot is caring too well for the direct recipient of the care, namely the child, but that it's displacing the mother.
Exactly.
And it seems like it's kind of natural that when we first think about technology and care, we evaluate how good will they be at caregiving. But it seems like an important part of the evaluation is will they displace the kind of caregiving we want to provide directly. And so it seems like an important angle to bring out is what part of it is it that we want to be providing a contribution directly to other people's needs.
Right, and I think this speaks to the distinctive nature of care work, which is not instrumental, it's relationship building. And what the mother fears is not that, I think, and I should have clarified this, I don't think it's so much that she feels like she's been out before, but she feels like her ability to form a bond with her child has been impaired. And I think that this is why I always said, I kind of inserted in the beginning of my definition of care provision, the social climate, maintaining the social climate. And I think a lot of care is intended not just to serve instrumental needs, but also to build relationships of mutual concern and reciprocity. And that's that's one of the reasons I think why it's not as substitutable as we like to think it could be. Thank you for bringing that up.
Just a quick point I forgot to mention was that there's a political philosopher named Kimberly Brownlee who's written about the importance of being a social contributor to others in these very diffuse ways that might be of interest.
Kimberly Brownlee.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Maybe our last one.
Well, I really loved that talk, and I think you raised a lot of really interesting points. I was wondering if, part of your thinking about this, you think about the idea of burnout, because I find the literature on burnout really fascinating. I think it speaks to this idea. We were talking a little bit about like these models that say that there's this shirking problem that workers, any opportunity they get, they sit around and they don't work, kind of vision of the world. But the burnout model is kind of the opposite, right? It's like that there are these ways that the economy or that employers harness people really caring about their work. And also we increasingly, maybe millennials especially, kind of grew up in a world where the idea of doing what you love for work was really important, and we've seen burnout extended to journalism, academia, right? There's all of these workers where the fact that they are doing their work,
Yeah.
you know, out of love. And I find that the thing that I find really helpful about the burnout literature, and I wonder if it's a lens on some of the dynamics you're talking about, is like, at least when they do the analyses for like workers in healthcare, the idea is that like what generates burnout is that you care about your work, but you're under-resourced.
And you're not allowed to provide the level of care that you would like to provide.
Yeah, and so
Absolutely.
and so, but I wonder if like, you know, one of the, like there's a positive story there somehow about maybe where technological development could go, which is maybe not a story about like, can we use technologies to replace us in these activities,
Yeah.
but can we use technologies to lead to a situation in which we, you know, in which we kind of have the resources to do the work we love.
Yeah, and
Something
I think that's right, and I think several of the talks this weekend, including Julie's, made me really appreciate the importance of that, telling a positive story, not just, you know, here's what's bad about the current organization of the care sector, but here's how, if we reorganize the care sector in ways that really respected and honored care work, it would become more sustainable and higher quality and serve us in the long run much better. And I think it's really important to draw analogies between resource depletion and climate change and what's happening to care provision. I think it is being overexploited and used unsustainably without much regard for how to maintain the continuing services that we need to rely on. And I also think it's a discourse that invokes quote unquote family values in a positive socialist framework that says we need more time for ourselves to provide care, not just for our family, but for our friends and for our neighbors and for our community. And the current machine is not allowing us to do that. The current machine is preventing us, from that. And I think that's a much more powerful argument in favor of a shorter work week than just wanting more leisure time or having more time for hobbies. I like hobbies too. I think leisure is in fact really important to avoid burnout, right? But I just think it makes it sound, emphasizing, we need more leisure, makes it sound like a kind of upscale, yucky vision of life that I think a lot of people in middle America have good reason to be very skeptical of.
Okay, so that was a fantastic talk, thank you. I'm going to end by asking for a little bit of reflection about the sort of development and installation of technology, these new technologies in the unpaid sector of the economy versus the paid sector. In the overworked American, I argue that there was a big bias against labor-saving technology for household work because of the lack of an opportunity. For like a lot of the mid-20th century, the lack of an opportunity cost for women's labor because they were at home. And then, gender inequality, and there are lots of reasons why that asymmetry still exists, even though, women are much more in the paid labor force now. But just wondering if you could say something about how you think that sort of the path of technological development in unpaid, for the unpaid work, either just on its own or relative to what you expect to see in the market economy.
Yeah, those are really good points. I'm not so sure that I have a good prediction, but I think have an insight, which is that I think people haven't paid enough attention to the complementarity and joint production of childcare, elder care, and housework. And there are a lot of women who are at home because they can't afford childcare, or that the earnings that they can get in the labor market are not sufficiently high to afford childcare. And because they're constrained to be at home supervising their kids, the only productive thing they can do is housework. And they want to make a contribution to their family's living standards. It's gendered and men don't do their share. I'm totally on board with that part of the story. But there's another part of the story, which is that we haven't thought enough about how supervisory constraints from children actually increase housework. And I think that there's a lot of really good stuff for researching that. I don't know, another thing I was talking to Maria about before was, I think it's, and I had mentioned this to you too, that now that work from home is a very real possibility for highly educated workers. It has some very negative consequences for earnings inequality and class differences that we need to be attentive to. But it pisses me off that employers and employer organizations argue that it's less productive, it's going to be isolating, people aren't going to be as creative, we're going to pay a big price for it. Even if that were true, which I don't think it is, even if it were true, the social productivity of being able to work from home is so great that it far overruns any loss in what we would measure according to a market metric of its effect on GDP. And I think that the continuing and pathological obsession with GDP and growth in the world is a really major obstacle to everything that we